Hi guys, so today's video is going to be my February wrap up, and I'm going to do things a little bit different this time around. I will have all of the books that I'm going to be talking about in the description bar down below with timestamps. That way, if you really want to hear my thoughts about a couple of the books, or if you are pressed for time and you can only really have time to see a specific one, then that will be there for your convenience. Jumping into it though, the first couple that I want to talk about would be February's buddy read books. So we'll start with Vengeful, and this particular book I was so thrilled with. It is a sequel to Vicious, and the setup for this story is that it's basically our world, but there are some individuals who, once they have died, but they quickly came back, they have acquired powers, and a lot of these powers are really, really unique and fascinating, and they are different from one person to the next. These individuals are known as extraordinary, or EOs, and the general population does not know they exist. We follow a couple of these people, and they hate each other. In the first book, you have this really cool setup where you don't really know why they hate each other, because you get glimpses of them in the past when they were best friends, and then now they want to kill each other, and you don't know why. And it's not just past and present, it's just a totally scattered timeline, and it's really fun to try to piece together how everything is going to eventually click. The next buddy read book was very different from Vengeful, and it was Geekerella. This is a young adult romance contemporary story, and it is kind of like a Cinderella retelling. It's about a girl who's obsessed with this one particular sci-fi show. The person who is cast to play the main lead, she just is so upset by, because it just looks like some pretty boy actor who's on the rise, and she just feels betrayed. Like, they don't care, the people that are casting this person, they just want some hot young talent. And then you also get his perspective. Turns out he's a huge fan, and it's just very cutesy. And despite being very cutesy, it actually does tap into some pretty difficult things about growing up with parents who are terrible parents, and in our main character's case, not having her parents and being raised by a stepmom who doesn't really care about her. So even though it was cute and it definitely played around with the way fandoms can affect our lives, there was also some pretty heavy things that would occur, and there were some pretty good moments with a decent amount of depth that I was not expecting. Next up, we have Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. I so didn't care for it. I always try to speak in a way about books that, even when I'm aware that I didn't care for it for subjective reasons, I still try to pinpoint what might make it appealing to you. And for this book, I think the fact that it is incredibly fast-paced with tons of action, I think that it's going to be really appealing to a lot of people. And also it's short, and sometimes that's pretty rare. With adult fantasy, the setup for the story is we follow a single main character, first-person point of view, so you get him telling his story, and he's very cheeky. The narration is kind of funny, but mixed in are some really dark moments, and there's a lot of violence in this world. And our main character was a part of this group of individuals known as the Greatcoats, and they served the king's law, and he was very close to the king himself, but you find out the king was taken over by dukes and duchesses, and now everybody looks down upon the Greatcoats, and they are still trying to live honorably. You kind of have this underdog setup, which I usually find really appealing, but I just kind of hated Falkio a lot. And I didn't really care for how things transpired throughout the book. I really, really liked the beginning a lot, but as the story progressed, things felt more and more random. I didn't feel like a lot of the intense scenes were as intense as they could have been, because things weren't really foreshadowed. I also found that a lot of times the situations that the character would wind up in, he could get out of very easily, either because something just showed up, somebody had already planned ahead for this, and it was completely outside of his control, and so things just kind of would be resolved. And on top of that, our character, there would be numerous times when they would be quite injured, and then they would just keep on going. I mean, at the beginning of the book, he's shot in the leg with a crossbow bolt, and then in pretty much the very next part, he's fighting 5 men, and doing really well, and I'm just like, dude, you just got shot. It was like that a lot throughout the story. Plus, there's some instances of how rape is handled in the story that I'm not opposed to these very dark topics being explored in books, but for my own personal preference, I didn't really like the way in which it was explored or the lack of exploration. Next up, we have a book that I am not quite finished with, but I have about 100 pages to go. And I feel like I don't know how to describe this book. It's Queens of Innis Lear by Tessa Gratton, I believe her last name is. And this story is so incredibly well written. It's probably one of the best written fantasy books I shouldn't say fantasy. I should just say books. It's one of the best written books I've read. I just happen to read mostly fantasy, so that's what came out of my mouth. It was not a jab at this genre that I love. But I have just found myself really mesmerized by the way in which the author writes and her descriptions, but I also have found that it's so slow. I hesitate to say that because I don't want to give the wrong impression of this book. I am really liking it, and I think the author has a way of exploring these characters with such nuance, and they are so complex, and the relationships across the board are really complicated. But it's so slow. What kind of bums me out is I really do think that this author has taken so much time and effort into crafting this story and every single sentence and every single paragraph. But I happened to check the ratings on Goodreads and they're incredibly low. And that's why I don't want to say that I think it's kind of slow and boring, because I feel like this book is not really getting the attention it deserves. If you're looking for a story with really interesting, complex characters with so much nuance, I think that you'll like this story. There's just so much to it. When I finish it, I am absolutely going to do an in-depth review because there's so much to talk about with this particular book. I'm really hoping the ending is good. Speaking of endings, I adored the end of the Ash Princess series by Laura Sebastian. Oh my gosh, did I like this ending. So the first two books, I have mentioned them quite a lot in recommendation videos, and I usually describe them as incredibly tropey, but entertaining, and there's a morbid premise and there's some violence, but man, is it a page turner. That's kind of how I've always described the first two books, Ash Princess and Lady Smoke. And then the third one, it was like getting hit by a bus. It made me so emotional. I almost cried multiple times reading that book, and I am not a book crier, so I have yet to cry reading a book. That one almost made me cry when I was doing my review for it in the spoilers section. I almost cried again. It was really emotional. The setup for this whole story is that we follow a girl whose kingdom was conquered. She was the heir to the throne. They kept her, and they use her now against her people if her people try to rebel. If there's even a hint of rebellion, they publicly beat her, and she's grown up in the court being mocked by her oppressors. So her life sucks, and then she gets a spark of hope, and she decides, I'm gonna stop being used against my people, and I'm gonna do something for them, and I'm going to do it from the inside. So the premise, I think, is great. It does have some tropes that we've seen and not everybody loves. It's got a love triangle in it. I do think the love triangle kind of takes a back seat as the story progresses. It never really frustrated me, but I know some people hate those. There's also the whole heir to the throne, trying to get your throne back type thing that's been used a lot. It's very familiar. But I always had a good time reading the first two. I wouldn't say I thought there was tons and tons and tons of depth in the first two, but the third one changed that. The conclusion to the trilogy I thought was phenomenal, and man, it knocked it out of the park. It's definitely one of my new favorite series. Not my absolute favorite, but it's up in that top list. Next, we have the second book in the Grisha trilogy. I think it's technically called the Shadow and Bone trilogy. And this is a series that follows a girl who, at the beginning of the first book, discovers that she has powers, and these powers are the ones that they think are going to save the world from this darkness that is separating the country that she lives in and these monsters that are there. Her power is supposed to be the only power that can stop it, but she's this young, clueless girl. She was an orphan growing up. She's kind of like a nobody. And all of a sudden, she's put in a position where she has all this power, or the potential for power, on top of having literal powers. She's kind of becoming a political figure. She's kind of becoming a religious figure to a lot of people, and she doesn't really know how to handle that. She's just this clueless girl. And I think this story can be really aggravating for some people because she really is so clueless a lot of the times, and people are like, she's so dumb. But when I think about it, I'm like, I would be dumb too. I don't think I'd know how to handle that situation. And all she wants is a simple life with her best friend / her huge crush, Mal. That's all she wants, and that's not at all what she's getting. And I can understand why it would be frustrating for people, but this is a reread for me, and I wasn't sure. I was like, man, did I just have lower expectations back in the day? I'm going to pick these up, and am I going to hate them? And I have not. I've been pleasantly surprised. I still really enjoy them. I think they're a great entry into the fantasy genre. I also think that it is a young adult story, so for younger people who are wanting to get into fantasy, I think it's a great start. And you know what? I liked both the first and the second one, and I'm super pumped to pick up the third. I'm going to mention 2 other books that I have started but haven't finished, and I still have a decent amount to go, but I just want to mention them really quick. One of them would be Ever the Brave. It's right there. It's the sequel to Ever the Hunted, and it follows a girl who is phenomenal at tracking, and she is kind of assigned with discovering who murdered her father. So the first one, they think that the person who murdered her father was her childhood best friend / crush. That seems to be a theme in young adult books, I guess. But she doesn't really know what's going on, and she hopes that he didn't do it, but at the same time, all the clues are pointing to him. The book was fairly atmospheric, and you only really get glimpses of the potential, I think, for the world building in this world. There's a decent amount of it, but you only scratch the surface. The second one, starting to open up more, which also means we're starting to get other perspectives, one of which so far I don't care about, and I kind of just want to stick to the characters from the first one, but at the same time I'm excited about the world opening up. I don't think I'm far enough along to really decide if I'm down with these new perspectives and the opening up of the world, or if I actually preferred the more intimate relationships with the smaller cast. The other book that I started and hardly got into, but I'll just mention it really quick, would be Spellhacker. This is a new release. It's supposed to be a heist story. It's supposed to be really fast-paced. I think it's kind of got almost like an urban fantasy type of vibe. And I mentioned in a vlog that this story is confusing me because the writing feels very youthful, which makes sense because it's young adult, but young adult is confusing in that it's such a random range of maturity levels, and so when I say it feels very youthful, I mean it feels like the younger end of young adult, but then it's combined with a lot of cursing, and I don't care if there's cursing, but at the same time I'm like, well, if this is meant to be sort of written for 12-year-olds, and then you're using the F word a lot in the first small amount of pages that I read, not like every other word, but it's there, it's just kind of like, I haven't wrapped my head around quite yet who this is for. No big deal. I mean, if I keep going and I like the story, I'll like the story, and I don't really care who it's designated for, because you can read outside of your demographic. But I don't know yet how it's going to go. It might end up feeling too young for me. Maybe I'll end up really loving it. I think the main thing is that the character feels very young. I think that's actually more of what it is, and I don't know yet if I'm going to like them or not. Anyway, I'll have purchase links to all of the books that I mentioned in the description bar down below, along with the timestamps I mentioned, and if I have reviews for any of these, I will post those as well. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.